The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Sir Oliver Sacks. In content nostalgia. If I encountered reminiscence occasionally in the context of epilepsy or migraine, I encountered it commonly in my post-encephalitic patients excited by L-DOPA, so much so that I found myself calling L-DOPA a sort of strange and personal time machine. It was so dramatic in one patient that I made her the subject of a letter to the editor, published in the Lancet in June 1970, and printed below. Here I found myself thinking of reminiscence in its strict Jacksonian sense as a convulsive upsurge of memories from the remote past. Later, I came to write the history of this patient, Rose R., in Awakenings. I thought less in terms of reminiscence and more in terms of stoppage. Has she never moved on from 1926? I wrote. And these are the terms in which Harold Pinter portrays Deborah in A Kind of Alaska. One of the most astonishing effects of L-DOPA when given to a certain post-encephalitic patients is the reactivation of symptoms and behavior patterns present at a much earlier stage of the disease, but subsequently lost. We have already commented in this connection on the exacerbation or recurrence of respiratory crisis, oculargic crisis, icterigic hyperkinesis, and tics. We have also observed the reactivation of many other dormant, primitive symptoms such as myoclonus, bulimia, polydipsia, satriasis, central pain, force defects, etc. At still higher levels of function, we have seen the return and reactivation of elaborate, affectively charged moral postures, thought systems, dreams, and memories, all forgotten, repressed, or otherwise inactivated in the limbo of profoundly akinetic and sometimes apathetic post-encephalitic illness. A striking example of forced reminiscence induced by L-DOPA was seen in the case of a 63-year-old woman who had had progressive post-encephalitic Parkinsonism since the age of 80, and had been institutionalized in the state of almost continuous oculargic trance for 24 years. L-DOPA produced at first a dramatic release from her Parkinsonism and oculargic entrancement, allowing almost normal speech and movement. Soon there followed, as in several of our patients, a psychomotor excitement with increased libido. This period was marked by nostalgia, joyful identification with a useful self, an uncontrollable upsurge of remote sexual memories and illusions. The patient requested a tape recorder and in the course of a few days recorded innumerable salacious songs, dirty jokes, and limericks, all derived from party gossip, smutty comics, nightclubs, and music halls of the middle and late 1920s. These recitals were enlivened by repeated allusions to then contemporary events and the use of obsolete colloquialisms, annotations, and social mannerisms irresistibly evocative of that bygone flabbers era. Nobody was more astonished than the patient herself. "It's amazing," she said. "I can't understand it. I haven't heard or thought of these things for more than 40 years. I never knew I still knew them. But now they keep running through my mind. Increasing excitement necessitated a reduction of the dosage of L-DOPA, and with this patient, though remaining quite articulate, instantly forgot all these earlier memories and was never again able to recall a single line of the songs she had recorded. Forced reminiscence, usually associated with a sense of déjà vu and in Jacksonian terms, doubling of consciousness, occurs rather commonly in attacks of migraine and epilepsy, in hypnotic and psychotic states, and less dramatically in everybody in response to the powerful mnemonic stimulus of certain words, sounds, scenes, and especially smells. Sudden memory upsurge has been described as occurring in ecologic crisis, and in a case described by Zott in which thousands of memories suddenly crowded into the patient's mind. Winfield and Barrett have been able to evoke stereotyped recalls by stimulating epileptogenic points in the cortex, and surmise that naturally occurring or artificially induced seizures occurring in such patients activate fossilized memory sequences in the brain. We summarize that our patient, like everybody, is stacked with an almost infinite number of dormant memory traces, some of which can be reactivated under special conditions, especially conditions of overwhelming excitement. Such traces, we conceive, like the subcortical imprints of remote events far below the horizon of mental life, are indelibly etched in the nervous system, and may persist indefinitely in a state of abeyance, due either to lack of excitation or to positive inhibition. The effects of their excitation or disinhibition may, of course, be identical or mutually provocative. We doubt, however, whether it is adequate to speak of our patient's memories as having been simply repressed during her illness and then depressed in response to L-DOPA. The forced reminiscence induced by L-DOPA, cortical blobs, migraines, epilepsies, crises, etc., would seem to be primarily an excitation, while the incontinently nostalgic reminiscence of old age, and sometimes of drunkenness, seems closer to a disinhibition and uncovering of archaic traces. All of these states can release memory, and all of them can lead to a re-experience and reenactment of the past. 17. A Passage to India. Bhagwa Handi B., an Indian girl of 19, with a malignant brain tumor, was admitted to her hospice in 1978. The tumor, an astrocytoma, had first presented when she was 7, but was then of low malignancy and well circumscribed, allowing a complete resection and complete return of function, and allowing Bhagwahandi to return to normal life. This reprieve lasted for 10 years, during which she lived life to the full, lived it gratefully and consciously to the full, for she knew, she was a bright girl, that she had a time bomb in her head. In her 18th year the tumor recurred, much more invasive and malignant now, no longer removable. A decompression was performed to allow its expansion, and it was with this, with weakness and numbness to the left side, with occasional seizures and other problems, that Bhagwahandi was admitted. She was, at first, remarkably cheerful, seemingly to accept fully the fate which lies in store, but still eager to be with people and do things, enjoy and experience as long as she could. As the tumor inched forward to her temporal lobe and the decompression started to bulge, we put her on steroids to reduce cerebral edema. Her seizures became more frequent and stranger. The original seizures were grand mal convulsions, and these she continued to have on occasion. Her new ones had a different character altogether. She wouldn't lose consciousness, but she would look and feel dreamy, and it was easy to ascertain and confirm by EEG that she was now having frequent temporal lobe seizures, which, as Hugling Jackson thought, are often characterized by a dreamy state and involuntary reminiscence. Soon this vague dreaminess looked on a more defined, more concrete, and more visionary character. It now took the form of visions of India, landscapes, villages, homes, gardens, which Bhagwandi recognized at once as places she had known and loved as a child. "Do these distress you?" we asked. "We can change the medication." "No," she said, with a peaceful smile. "I like these dreams. They take me back home." At times there were people, usually her family or neighbors from her old home village. Sometimes there was speech or singing or dancing. Once she was in church, once in the graveyard, but mostly they were the plains, the fields, the rice paddies near her village, and the low, sweet hills which swept up to the horizon. Were these all temporal lobe seizures? This first seemed the case, but now we were less sure, for temporal lobe seizures, as Hugling-Jackson emphasized, and Wilder Penfield was able by stimulation of the exposed brain to confirm, tend to have a rather fixed format, a single scene or song, unvaryingly reiterated, going with an equally fixed focus in the cortex. Whereas Bhagwandi's dreams had no such fixity, but presented ever-changing panoramas and dissolving landscapes to her eye. Was she then toxic and hallucinating from the massive doses of steroids she was now receiving? This seemed possible, but we couldn't reduce the steroids. She would have gone into coma and died within days. And steroid psychosis, so-called, is often excited and disorganized, whereas Bhagwandi's was always lucid, peaceful, and calm. Could they be, in the Forwoodian sense, fantasies or dreams, or the sort of dream madness, oenophoria, which may sometimes occur in schizophrenia? Here again we couldn't be certain, for though there were a phantasmagora of sort, yet the phantasms were clearly all memories. They occurred side by side with normal awareness and consciousness. Hugling-Jackson, as we have seen, speaks of a doubling of consciousness, and they weren't obviously overcast or charged with passionate drives. They seemed more like certain paintings or tone poems, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, evocation, revocation, visitation to and from a loved and cherished childhood. Day by day, week by week, the dreams, the visions, came oftener, grew deeper. They weren't occasional now, but occupied most of the day. We would see her wrapped, as if in a trance, her eyes sometimes closed, sometimes open but unseeing, and always a faint, mysterious smile on her face. If anyone approached her or asked her something, and the nurses had to do, she would respond at once, lucidly and courteously. But there was, even among the most down-to-earth staff, a feeling that she was in another world, and that we shouldn't interrupt her. I shared this feeling, and though curious, was reluctant to probe. Once, just once, I said, "Bhagwandi, what is happening?" "I am dying," she answered. "I'm going home. I'm going back where I came from. You might call it my return." Another week passed, and now Bhagwandi no longer responded to external stimuli, but seemed wholly enveloped in a world of her own. Though her eyes were closed, her face still bore its faint, happy smile. "She's on the return journey," the staff said. "She'll soon be there." 3 days later she died, or should we say, arrived, having completed her passage to India. 18. The Dog Beneath the Skin. Stephen D., aged 22, medical student, on highs, cocaine, BCB, chiefly amphetamines. Vivid dream one night. Dreamt he was a dog, in a world unimmeasurably rich and significant in smells. The happy smell of water, the brave smell of stone. 19. Murder. Donald killed his girl while under the influence of BCB. He had, or seemed to have, no memory of the deed, and neither hypnosis nor sodium amylate served to release any. There was, therefore, it was concluded when he stood trial, not a repression of a memory, but an organic amnesia, the sort of a blackout well described with BCB. The details, manifest of forensic examination, were macabre, and couldn't be revealed in open court. They were discussed in camera, concealed from both the public and from Donald himself. Comparison was made with the act of violence occasionally committed during temporal lobe or psychomotor seizures. There is no memory of such acts, and perhaps no intention of violence. Those who commit them are considered neither responsible nor culpable, but are none the less committed for their own and others' safety. This was what happened with the unfortunate Donald. He spent 4 years in psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. Despite doubts as to whether he was either criminal or insane, he seemed to accept his incarceration with a certain relief. The sense of punishment was perhaps welcome, and there was, he doubtless felt, security in isolation. "I'm not fit for society," he would say, mournfully, when questioned. Security from sudden, dangerous, uncontrolled security, and a sort of serenity too. He had always been interested in plants, and this interest, so constructive, and so remote from the danger zone of human relation and action, was strangely encouraged in the prison hospital where he now lived. He took over its raged, unintended grounds, and created flower gardens, kitchen gardens, gardens of all sorts. He seemed to have achieved a sort of austere equilibrium, in which human relations, human passions, previously so tempestuous, were replaced by strange calm. Some considered him schizoid, some sane. Every one felt he had achieved a sort of stability. In his fifth year he started to go out on parole. Being able to leave the hospital on weekend basis, he had been an avid cyclist, and now he again bought a bike, and it was with this which precipitated the second act of his strange history. He was paddling fast, as he liked to, down a steep hill when an oncoming car, badly driven, suddenly loomed on a blind turn. Swerving to avoid a head-on collision, he lost control and was flung violently headfirst onto the road. He sustained a severe head injury, massive bilateral subdural hematomas which were at once surgically evacuated and drained, and severe contusion of both frontal lobes. He lay in a coma, hemiplegic for almost 2 weeks. And then, unexpectedly, he started to recover. And now at this point the nightmares began. The returning, the redowning of a consciousness was not sweet. It was busied by a hideous agitation and turmoil, in which the half-conscious Donald seemed to be violently struggling, and kept crying, "Oh God, no." As consciousness grew clearer, so memory, full memory, and now terrible memory came within it. There were severe neurological problems, left-sided weakness and numbness, seizures, and severe frontal lobe deficits, and with these was the last of these, something totally new. The murder, the deed, lost to memory before, now stood before him in vivid, almost hallucinatory detail. Uncontrollable reminiscence welled up and overwhelmed him. He kept seeing the murder, enacting it again and again. Was this nightmare? Was this madness? Or was there now hypermnesis, a breakthrough of genuine, vertical, terrifyingly heightened memories? He was questioned in great detail with the greatest care to avoid any hints or suggestions, and it was very soon clear that what he now showed was a genuine, if uncontrollable, reminiscence. He now knew the minute details of the murder. All the details revealed by forensic examination, but never revealed in open court, or to him. All that had been or seemed previously lost or forgotten, even in the face of hypnosis or a lethal injection, was now recovered and recoverable. More, it was uncontrollable and still more completely unbearable. He twice attempted suicide on the neurosurgical unit and had to be heavily tranquilized and forcibly restrained. What had happened to Donald? What was happening with him? That this was a sudden eruption of psychotic fantasy was ruled out by the veridical quality of reminiscence shown, and even if it was entirely psychotic fantasy, why should it occur now, quite suddenly, unprecedentedly, with his head injury? There was a psychotic or near psychotic charge to the memories. They were in psychiatric parlance intensely or over-castigated, so much so as to drive Donald to insensate thoughts of suicide. But what would be a normal cathexis for such a memory? The sudden emergence from total amnesia, not of some obscure audible struggle or guilt, but of an actual murder. Was it possible that with the loss of frontal lobe integrity an essential prerequisite of repression had been lost, and that what we now saw was a sudden expulsive and specific de-repression? None of us had ever heard or read of anything quite like this before, although all of us were very familiar with the general disinhibition seen in frontal lobe syndromes, and impulsiveness, the factitiousness, the loquacity, the salacity, the exhibition of uninhibited, non-combatant, vulgar ID. But this wasn't the character which Donald now showed. He was not impulsive, unselective, inappropriate in the least. His character, judgment, and general personality were wholly preserved. It was specifically and solely memories and feelings of the murder which now erupted uncontrollably, obsessingly, and tormenting him. Was there a specific excitatory or epileptic element involved? Here, EEG studies were especially interesting because it was evident, using special nasopharyngeal electrodes, that in addition to occasional grand mal seizures there was an incessant seizing, a deep epilepsy in both temporal lobes extending down, one might surmise, but it would need implanted electrodes to confirm, into the ancus, the amygdala, the limbic structures, the emotional circuitry which lies deep to the temporal lobes. Binfield and Barrett, 1963, had reported recurrent reminiscence or experiential hallucinations in some patients with temporal lobe seizures. But most of the experiences of reminiscence which Binfield described here were of somewhat passive sort: hearing music, seeing scenes, being present perhaps, but present as a spectator, not as an actor, and yet this wasn't invariably so. In one particularly horrifying traumatic case recorded by Winfield, the patient, a girl of 12, seemed to herself in every seizure to be running frantically from a murderous man who was pursuing her with a whirling bag of snakes. This experiential hallucinations was a precise reply to an actual horrid incident which had occurred 5 years before. None of us had heard of such patient re-experiencing, or rather re-enacting, a deed. But this apparently was what was happening with Donald. No clear decision was ever reached. It remains only to tell the rest of the story. Youth, luck, time, natural healing, superior pre-traumatic function, aided by Lorcan therapy for frontal lobe substitution, have allowed Donald, over the years, to make an enormous recovery. His frontal lobe functions now were almost normal. The use of new anticonvulsants, now only available in the last few years, have allowed effective control of his temporal lobe seizing. And here again, probably, natural recovery has played a part. Finally, with sensitive and supportive regular psychotherapy, the bunted violence of Donald, self-accusing, superego has been mitigated, and the gentler scales of the ego now hold court. But the most important thing in this, that Donald has now returned to gardening. I feel at peace gardening, he says to me. No conflicts arise. Plants don't have egos. They can hurt your feelings. The final therapy, as Freud said, is work and love. Donald has not forgotten or repressed anything of the murder, if indeed repression was operative in the first place, but he is no longer oppressed by it. Physiological and moral balance has been struck. But what is the status of the first loss, then recovered memory? Why amnesia, an expulsive return? Why the total blackout and then the lurid flashbacks? what actually happened in this strange half-neurological drama. All these questions remain a mystery to this day. 20. The Visions of Hildegard. The religious literature of all ages is replete with descriptions of visions, in which sublime and infallible feelings have been accompanied by the experience of radiant luminosity. William James speaks of photism in this context. It's impossible to ascertain in the vast majority of cases whether the experience represents a hysterical or psychotic ecstasy, the effects of intoxication, or an epileptic or migrainous manifestations. A unique exception is provided in the case of Hildegard of Bingen (1098–1180), a nun and a mystic of exceptional intellectual and literary powers, who experienced countless visions from earliest childhood to the close of her life, and has left exquisite accounts and figures of these in the two manuscript codex which have come down to us, Scaevius and Liber Divinium Obrum, Book of Divine Works. A careful consideration of these accounts and figures leaves no room for doubt concerning their nature. They were indisputably migraneous, and they illustrate, indeed, many of the varieties of visual aura earlier discussed. In the course of an extensive essay on Hildegard visions, selects the following phenomena as most characteristic of them. In all, a prominent feature is a point or group of points of light, which shimmer and move, usually in a wave-like manner, and are most often interpreted as stars or flaming eyes. In quite a number of cases one light, larger than the rest, exhibits a series of concentric circular figures of wavering form, and often definite fortification figures are described, radiating in some cases from a colored area. Often the lights gave the impression of working, boiling, or fermenting, described by so many visionaries. Hildegard writes, "The vision which I saw I beheld neither in sleep, nor in dreams, nor in madness, nor with my carnal eyes, nor with the ears of the flesh, nor in hidden places, but wakeful, alert, and with the eyes of the spirit and the inward ears, I perceived them in open view and according to the will of God." One such vision, illustrated by a figure of stars falling and being quenched in the ocean, signifies for her the fall of the angels. I saw a great star most splendid and beautiful, and with it an exceeding multitude of falling stars, which was the star followed southward, and suddenly they were all annihilated, being turned into black coals, and cast into the abyss so that I could see them no more. Such is Hildegard's allegoric interpretation. Our literal interpretation would be that she experienced a shower of phosphens transient across the visual field, this passage being succeeded by a negative scotoma. Visions was fortification. Figures are represented in her Zelius die and Sedis Lacetica, the fortifications radiating from a brilliantly luminescence and in the original shimmering and colored point. These two visions are combined in a composite vision, first picture, and in this she interprets fortification and The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Sir Oliver Sacks. Part 4. The World of the Symbol. Introduction. When I started working with retards several years ago, I thought it would be dismal and wrote this to Laura. To my surprise, he replied in the most positive terms and said that there were no patients, in general, more dear to him, and that he counted his hours and years at the Institute of Defectology among the most moving and interesting of his entire professional life. He expresses a similar sentiment in the preface to the first of his clinical biographies, Speech and the Development of Mental Processes in the Child, 1959. If an author has the right to express feelings about his own work, I must note the warm sense with which I always turn to the material published in this small book. What is this warm sense of which Laura speaks? It's clearly the expression of something emotional and personal, which wouldn't be possible if the defective did not respond, did not themselves possess very real sensibilities, emotional and personal potentials. Whatever their intellectual defects, but it's more. It's an expression of scientific interest, of something that Laura considered of quite peculiar scientific interest. What could this be? Something other than defects and defectology, surely, which are of rather limited interest in themselves. What is it, then, that is specially interesting in the symbol? It has to do with qualities of mind which are preserved, even enhanced, so that though mentally defective in some ways, they may be mentally interesting, even mentally complete in others, qualities of mind other than the conceptual. This is what we may explore with peculiar clarity in the symbol mind. As we may also in the minds of children and savages, though as Clifford Gritz repeatedly emphasizes, these categories must never be equated. Savages are neither symbol nor children. Children have no savage culture, and the symbol are neither savages nor children. Yet there are important concepts, and that the baguette has opened out for us in the minds of children, and Levi-Strauss in the savage mind awaits us in a different form, in the mind and world of the symbol. All of Laura's early work was done in these three allied domains. His field work with children in primitive communities in Central Asia and his studies in the Institute of Defectology, together these launched his lifelong exploration of human imagination. What awaits our study is equally pleasing to the heart and mind, and as such, specially incites the impulse to Laura's romantic science. What is this quality of mind, this disposition which characterizes the symbol and gives them their poignant innocence, transparency, completeness and dignity? A quality so distinct, so distinctive, we must speak of the world of the symbol, as we speak of the world of the child or the savage. If we are to use a single word here, it would have to be concreteness. Their world is vivid, intense, detailed, yet simple, precisely because it's concrete, neither complicated, diluted, nor unified by abstractions. By sort of inversion or subversion of the natural order of things, concreteness is often seen by neurologists as a rich thing, beneath consideration, incoherent, regressed. Thus, for Kurt Galtestein, the greatest systematizer of his generation, the mind, man's glory, lies wholly in the abstract and categorical, and the effect of brain damage, any and all brain damage, is to cast him from this high realm into the most subhuman swamlands of the concrete. If a man loses the abstract categorical attitude, Goldstein, or prepositional thought, Jackson, what remains is subhuman, if no moment or interest. I call this an inversion because the concrete is elemental. It's what makes reality real, alive, personal and meaningful. All of this is lost if the concrete is lost. As we saw in the case of the almost Martian Dr. B, the man who mistook his wife for a hat, who fell in an un-Goldstein way from the concrete to abstract. Much easier to comprehend, and altogether more natural, the idea of the preservation of the concrete in brain damaged, not regression to it, and preservation of it, so that the essential personality and identity and humanity, the being of the hurt creature, is preserved. This is what we see in Zestiski. The man was a shattered world, he remains a man, quintessentially a man, with all the moral weight and rich imagination of a man. Despite the devastation of his abstract and prepositional powers, here Laura, while seeming to be supporting the formulations of Jackson and Goldstein, is at the same time turning their significance upside down. Zestiski is no fable, Jacksonian or Goldstein relic, but a man in his full manhood, a man with his emotions, an imagination wholly preserved, perhaps enhanced. His world is not shattered, despite the book's title. It lacks unifying abstractions, but is experienced as an extraordinarily rich, deep, concrete reality. I believe all this to be true of the symbol also, the more so as, having been symbol from the start, they have never known but used by the abstract, but have always experienced reality direct and unmediated, with an elemental and at times overwhelming intensity. We found ourselves entering a realm of fascination and paradox, all of which centers on the ambiguity of the concrete. In particular, as physicians, as therapists, as teachers, as scientists, we are invited, indeed compelled, towards an exploration of the concrete. This is Laura's romantic science. Both of Laura's great clinical biographies or novels may indeed be seen as exploration of the concrete, its preservation in the service of reality, in the brain-damaged Dostoevsky, its exaggeration at the expense of reality in the supermind of the monomist. Clinical science has no use for the concrete. It's equated with the trivial in neurology and psychiatry. It needs a romantic science to pay it its full due, to appreciate its extraordinary powers and dangers. And in the symbol we are confronted with the concrete head-on, the concrete pure and simple in unreserved intensity. The concrete can open doors, and it can close them too. It can constitute the portal to sensibility, imagination, depth, or it can confine the possessor or the possessed by meaningless particulars. We see both of these potentials as if it were amplified in the symbol. enhanced powers of concrete imaginary and memory, nature's compensations of defectiveness in the conceptual and abstract, can tend in quite opposite directions, towards an obsessive preoccupation with particulars. The development of an eidetic imagery and memory, and the mentality of the performer or whiz-kid, as occurred with the mnemonist, and in ancient times with over-cultivation of the concrete art of memory. We see tendencies to this in Martin A. chapter 22, in Joe's chapter 24, and especially the twins, chapter 23, exaggerated especially in the twins by the demands of public performance coupled with their own obsessionism and exhibitionism, but of much greater interest, much more man, much more moving, much more real, yet scarcely even recognized in scientific studies of the symbol, though immediately seen by sympathetic patients and parents and teachers, is the proper use and development of the concrete. The concrete equally may become a vehicle of mystery, beauty and depth, a basin to the emotions and imagination, the spirit, fully as much as any abstract conception, perhaps indeed more, as Scholem 1965 has argued in his contrasts of the conceptual and the symbolic, or Jeremy Bernner 1984 in his contrast of the paradigmatic and the narrative. The concrete is readily imbued with feeling and meaning, more readily perhaps than any abstract conception. It readily moves into the aesthetic, the dramatic, the comic, the symbolic. The whole wide deep world of art and spirit. Conceptually, then, mental defectives may be cripples, but in their powers of concrete and symbolic apprehension they may be fully the equal of any normal individual. This is science, this is romance too. No one has expressed this more beautifully than Kierkegaard in the words he wrote of his deathbed. Though plain man, he writes, and I paraphrase slightly, the symbolism of the scriptures is something infinitely high, but it is not high in a sense that has anything to do with intellectual elevation, or with the intellectual difference between man and man. No, it is not for all is this infinite high, attainable. A man may be very low intellectually, unable to put a key to the door, much less understand the Newton laws of motion, wholly unable to comprehend the world as concepts, and yet fully able, and indeed gifted in understanding the world as concreteness, as symbols. This is the other side, the almost sublime other side, of the singular creatures, the gifted simpletons, Martin, Joes, and the twins. Yet it may be said they are extraordinary and atypical. I therefore start this final section with Rebecca, a wholly unremarkable young woman, a simpleton with whom I worked 12 years ago. I remember her warmly. '21. Rebecca. Rebecca was no child when she was referred to our clinic. She was 19, but as her grandmother said, just like a child in some ways. She couldn't find her way around the block. She couldn't confidently open a door with a key. She could never see how the key went and never seemed to learn. She had left-right confusion. She sometimes put on her clothes the wrong way, inside out, back to front, without appearing to notice, or if she noticed, without being able to get them right. She might spend hours jamming a hand or foot into the wrong glove or shoe. She seemed, as her grandmother said, to have no sense of space. She was clumsy and ill-coordinated in all her movements. A klutz, one report said. a motor more on another, although when she danced, all her clumsiness disappeared. Rebecca had a partial cleft palate, which caused a whistling in her speech, short, stumpy fingers with blunt, deformed nails, and a high, degenerative myopia requiring very thick spectacles, all stigmata of the same congenital condition which had caused her cerebral and mental defects. She was painfully shy and was drawn, feeling that she was and had always been a figure of fun. But she was capable of warm, deep, even passionate attachments. She had deep love for her grandmother, who had brought her up since she was 3. When she was orphaned by the death of both parents, she was very fond of nature, and if she was taken to the city parks and botanic gardens, spent many happy hours there. She was very fond, too, of stories, though she never learned to read, despite assiduous and even frantic attempts, and would implore her grandmother or others to read to her. She has a hunger for stories, her grandmother said, and fortunately her grandmother loved reading stories and had a fine reading voice which kept Rebecca entranced, and not just stories, poetry too. This seemed a deep need or hunger in Rebecca, a necessary form of nourishment, of reality, of her mind. Nature was beautiful, but mute. It wasn't enough. She needed the world represented to her in verbal image, in language, and seemed to have little difficulty following the metaphors and symbols of even quite deep poems. In striking contrast to her incapacity with simple propositions and instructions, the language of feeling, of the concrete, of image and symbol formed a whole world she loved and, to a remarkable extent, could enter, though conceptually and propositionally inept. She was at home with a poetic language, and was herself in a stumbling, touching way, a sort of primitive, natural poet. Metaphors, figures of speech, rather striking similitude, would come naturally to her, though unpredictably, as sudden poetic ejaculations or elations. Her grandmother was devout in a quiet way, and this also was true of Rebecca. She loved the lighting of the Sabbath candles, and the benches and orisons which thread the Jewish day. She loved going to the synagogue, where she too was loved and seen as a child of God, a sort of innocent, a holy fool, and she fully understood the liturgy, the chants, the prayers, rites, and symbols which the Orthodox service consisted. All this was possible for her, accessible to her, loved by her, despite gross perceptual and spatio-temporal problems and gross impairments in every schematic capacity. She couldn't count change. The symbols calculation defeated her. She could never learn to read or write. She would average 60 or less in IQ tests, though doing notably better on the verbal than the performance parts of the test. Thus she was a moron, or a fool, a puppy, or had so appeared, and so been called throughout her whole life, but one with unexpected, strangely moving poetic power. Superficially she was a mass of handicaps and incapacities, with intense frustrations and anxieties attended on these. At this level she was, and felt herself to be, a mental cripple, beneath the effortless skills, the happy capacities of others, but at some deeper level there was no sense of handicap or incapacity, but a feeling of calm and completeness, of being fully alive and being a soul, deep and high and equal to others, intellectually. Then Rebecca felt a cripple, spiritually. She felt herself a full and complete being. When I first saw her, clumsy, uncouth, all of a fumble, I saw her merely or wholly as a casualty-broken creature, whose neurological impairments I could pick out and dissect with precision. A multitude of apraxias and agnosias, a mass of sensory motor impairments and breakdowns, limitation of intellectual schemata and concepts similar, by Baggett's criteria, to those of a child of 8. Poor thing, I said to myself, was perhaps a splinter skill, a freak gift of speech, a mere mosaic of higher cortical functions, biognate, bictine, schemata most impaired. The next time I saw her, it was all very different. I didn't have her in test situation, evaluating her in clinic. I wandered outside. It was a lovely spring day, with few minutes in hand before the clinic started, and there I saw Rebecca, sitting on a bench, gazing at the April foliage, quietly, with obvious delight. Her posture had none of the clumsiness which had so impressed me before. Sitting there in a light dress, her face calm, slightly smiling, she'd suddenly brought to mind one of Chok's young women, Irina, Aina, Sonia, and Nina, seen against the backdrop of Chokovonian cherry orchard. She could have been any young woman enjoying a beautiful spring day. This was my human as opposed to my neurological vision. As I approached, she heard my footsteps and turned, gave me a broad smile, and wordlessly gestured. "Look at the world," she seemed to say. "How beautiful it is." And there came out, in Jacksonian spurts, odd, sudden, poetic ejaculations. Spring, birth, growing, stirring, coming to life, seasons, everything in its time. I found myself thinking of Callistus. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time. This was what Rebecca in her disjointed fashion was ejaculating, a vision of seasons, of time, like that of Preacher. She is an idiot Eclastis, I said to myself, and in this phrase my two visions of her as idiot and as symbolist met, collided, and fused. She had done appealingly in the test which, in a sense, was designed, like all neurological and psychological testing, not merely to uncover, to bring out deficits, but to decompose her into functions and deficits. She had come apart horribly in formal testing, but now she was mysteriously together and composed. Why was she so composed before? How could she be so recomposed now? I had the strongest feeling of two wholly different modes of thought, or of organization, or of being. The first, schematic pattern, seeing, problem solving. This is what had been tested, and where she had been found so defective, so disastrously wanting. But the tests had given no inkling of anything but the deficits, of anything, so to speak, beyond her deficits. They had given me no hint of her positive powers, her ability to perceive the real world, the world of nature and perhaps of the imagination, as a coherent, intelligible, poetic whole, her ability to see this, think this, and, when she could, live this. They had given me no intimation of her inner world, which clearly was composed and coherent, and approached as something other than a set of problems or tasks. What was the composing principle which could allow her composure? Clearly it was something other than schematic. I found myself thinking of her fondness for tales, for narrative composition and coherence. Is it possible, I wondered, that this being before me, at once a charming girl and a moron, a cognitive mishap, can use a narrative or dramatic mode to compose and integrate a coherent world, in place of the schematic mode which in her is so defective that it simply does not work. And as I saw it I remembered her dancing, and how this could organize her otherwise ill-knit and clumsy movements. Our tests, our approaches, I thought, as I watched her on the bench, enjoying not just a symbol but a sacred view of nature, our approach, our evaluations are ridiculously inadequate. They only show us deficits, they don't show us powers, they only show us puzzles and schemata, when we need to see music, narrative, play, a being conducting itself spontaneously in its own natural way. Rebecca, I felt, was complete and intact as narrative being, in conditions which allowed her to organize herself in a narrative way, and this was something very important to know, for it allowed one to see her and her potential in a quite different fashion from that imposed by the schematic mode. It was perhaps fortunate that I chanced to see Rebecca in her so different modes, so damaged and incorrigible in the one, so full of promise and potential in the other, and that she was one of the first patients I saw in our clinic, for what I saw in her, what she showed me, I now saw in them all. As I continued to see her she seemed to deepen, or perhaps she revealed, or I came to respect her, depth more and more. They were not wholly happy depths, no depths even are, but they were predominantly happy for the greater part of the year. Then in November her grandmother died, and the light, the joy she had expressed in April, now turned into the deepest grief and darkness. She was devastated, but conducted herself with great dignity. Dignity, ethical depth was added at this time, to form a grave and lasting counterpoint to the light. Lyrically self I had especially seen before. I called on her as soon as I heard the news, and she received me with great dignity, but frozen with grief. In her small room in the now empty house her speech was again ejaculated, Jacksonian, in brief utterness of grief and lamentation. Why did she have to go? She cried, and added, I'm crying for me, not for her. Then, after an interval, Granny's all right. She's gone to her long home. Long home was her own symbol, or an unconscious memory of or allusion to Excelestius. I'm so cold, she cried, huddling into herself. It's not outside, it's winter inside, cold as death. She added, she was a part of me died with her. She was complete in her mourning, tragic and complete. There was absolutely no sense of her being then a mental defective. After half an hour, she, unfrozen, regarded some for warmth and animation, said, it's winter. I feel dead, but I know spring will come again. The work of grief was slow, but successful, as Rebecca, even when most stricken, anticipated. It was greatly helped by a sympathetic and supportive great aunt, a sister of her granny, who now moved into the house. It was greatly helped by the synagogue and the religious community, above all by the rites of sitting Shiva and the special status accorded her as the bereaved one, the chief mourner. It was helped too perhaps by her speaking freely to me, and it was helped also interestingly by dreams, which she related with animation, and which clearly marked stages in the grief work. As I remember her, like Nina in the April sun, so I remember her etched with tragic clearness in the dark November of that year, standing in a bleak cemetery in Queens, saying the Kaddish over her grandmother's grave. Prayers and Bible stories had always appealed to her, going with the happy, the lyrical, the blessing side of her life. Now in the funeral prayers, in the 103rd Psalm, and above all in the Kaddish, she found the right and only words for comfort and lamentation. During the intervening months between my first seeing her in April and her grandmother's death that November, Rebecca, like all our clients, an odious wording, becoming fashionably supposedly less discarding than patients, was pressed into a variety of workshops and classes as part of our developmental and cognitive drive. These too were in terms at the time. It didn't work with Rebecca, it didn't work with most of them, it was not, I came to think, the right thing to do. Because what we did was to drive them full tilt upon their limitations, as had already been done, futilely, and often to the point of cruelty throughout their lives. We paid far more attention to the defects of our patients, as Rebecca was the first to tell me, and far too little to what was intact or preserved. To use another piece of jargon, we were far too concerned with defectology, and far too little with narratology, the neglected and needed science of concrete. Rebecca made clear by concrete illustrations by her own self the two wholly different, wholly separate forms of thought and mind, paradigmatic and narrative in Brunner's terminology, and though equally natural and native to the expanding human mind, the narrative comes first, has spiritual priority. Very young children love and demand stories and can understand complex matter presented as stories. When their powers of comprehending general concepts, paradigms are almost non-existent. It's the narrative or symbolic power which gives a sense of the world, a concrete reality in the imaginative form of symbol and story, when abstract thought can provide nothing at all. A child follows the Bible before he follows Isolde, not because the Bible is simpler, the reverse might be said, but because it's cast in a symbolic and narrative mode. And in this way Rebecca at 19 was still, as her grandmother said, just like a child. Like a child, but not a child because she was adult. The term retarded suggests a persisting child. The term mentally defective, a defective child, both terms, both concepts, combine deep truth and felicity. Was Rebecca and with other defectives allowed or encouraged in personal development, the emotional and narrative and symbolic powers can develop strongly and exuberantly, may produce, as in Rebecca, a sort of natural poet, or as in Joe's, a sort of natural artist, while the paradigmatic or conceptual powers, manifestly feeble from the start, grind very slowly and painfully along, and are only capable of a very limited and stunted development. Rebecca realized this fully, as she had shown to me so clearly, right from the very first day I saw her, when she spoke of her clumsiness and of her ill-composed and ill-organized movement, became well-organized, composed, and fluent with music. And when she showed me how she herself was composed by natural scene, a scene with an organic, aesthetic, and dramatic unity and sense, rather suddenly after her grandmother's death she became clear and decisive. I want no more classes, no more workshops, he said. They do nothing for me, they do nothing to bring me together. And then, with that power for the opt model or metaphor I so admired, and which was so well developed in her despite her low IQ, she looked down at the office carpet and said, I'm like a sort of a living carpet. I need a pattern, a design like you have on that carpet. I come apart, I unravel unless there is a design. I looked down at the carpet as Rebecca said this, and found myself thinking of Shrinken's famous image, comparing the brain mind to an enchanted loom, weaving patterns ever dissolving, but always with meaning. I thought, can one have a raw carpet without a design? Can one have a design without the carpet? But this seemed like the smile without the Cheshire cat. A living carpet, as Rebecca said, had to have both, and she especially, with her lack of schematic structure, the wrap and woof, the net of the carpet, so to speak, might indeed unravel without a design, the scenic or narrative structure of the carpet. I must have meaning, she went on. The classes, the odd jobs have no meaning. What I really love, she added wistfully, is the theater. We removed Rebecca from the workshop she hated, and managed to enroll her in a special theater group. She loved this. It composed her. She did amazingly well. She became a complete person, biased, fluent, with style in each role, and now, if one sees Rebecca on stage for theater and the theater group, soon became her life. One would never even guess that she was mentally defective. Postscript. The power of music, narrative, and drama is of the greatest practical and theoretical importance. One may see this even in the case of idiots, whose IQ below 20, and the extremest motor incompetence and bewilderment. Their uncouth movement may disappear in a moment with music and dancing. Suddenly, with music, they know how to move. We see how the retarded, unable to perform fairly simple tasks involving perhaps 4 or 5 movements or procedures in sequence, can do they perfectly if they work to music. The sequence of movement they can't hold as schemes being perfectly holdable as music, embedded in music. The same may be seen very dramatically in patients with severe frontal lobe damage, anapraxia, and inability to do things, to retain the simplest motor sequences and programs, even to walk, despite perfectly preserved intelligence in all other ways. This procedural defect or motor idiocy, as one might call it, which completely defeats any ordinary system of rehabilitative instruction, vanishes at once if music is an instructor. All this, no doubt, is a rationale or one of the rationales of folk songs. What we see, fundamentally, is the power of music to organize and to do this effectuously as well as joyfully when abstract or schematic forms of organization fail. Indeed, it's especially dramatic, as one would expect, precisely when no other form of organization will work. Thus music, or any other form of narrative, is essential when working with the retarded or apraxic. Schooling or therapy to them must be centered on music or something equivalent. And in drama, there is still more. There is the power or rule to give the organization, to confer, while it lasts, an entire personality. The capacity to perform, to play, to be, and seems to be a given in human life in a way which has nothing to do with intellectual differences. One sees this with infants, one sees it with the senile, and one sees it most poignantly with the Rebecca of this world.